This is 107.6 FM, KUSA, your radio source for all things American. Welcome to the Lives of Great Americans Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Cartwright. This week, our subject is Frances Perkins, who was the first female cabinet secretary, and so much more. As our regular listeners know, we will interview 4 people from throughout Miss Perkins' life who knew her well. I will first introduce Mrs. Cynthia Perkins, Frances' grandmother. Hello, Mrs. Perkins.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today.
I'm delighted to get to talk about Fanny. That is, Frances.
Fanny?
Yes, my granddaughter was baptized Fanny Coralie Perkins, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I suppose you want to talk about her birth.
Might as well start there.
Well, she was born on April 10th, 1880. Her parents were my son, Frederick, and my daughter-in-law, Susan.
And where was she born?
She was born in Boston, but mind you, we were Maine people. Frederick had his stationery business in Massachusetts, but our family had been in Maine since before the Revolution. I still lived there, and Fanny always loved to visit me. I think she felt a little out of place at home sometimes.
And why was that?
Well, she was so curious and bright, even though she didn't always like to show it. I don't think her mother really understood her always. Her father did better, but then he's my son, and so I might be a little bit biased.
And how about her education? Did she go to school?
Did she go to school? Did she do anything else? Frederick taught her at home at first, but then they sent her to Worcester Classical High School. They lived in Worcester, Massachusetts. After that, they sent her to Mount Hiloki College. She was a lucky girl. Not a lot of girls get to study that much.
Did she enjoy that?
Yes, she loved it. She enjoyed her friends at college, and she really enjoyed one particular class. I'll tell you about it because I know it influenced her. It was about American economic history, and the girls had to go out and interview the factory workers. She never forgot that.
What kind of girl would you say she was?
Well, she was always a little bit what they called unconventional. I remember the time she told everyone she was a Democrat. That really shocked them. Funny thing is, afterwards she really became one.
So she already showed signs of her political future?
No one would have thought it at the time. No one would have imagined any girl becoming a cabinet secretary. But looking back, it made sense. I remember when she read that book, How the Other Half Lives, with the pictures of the poor folks in New York. She always cared about that sort of thing.
How interesting. It sounds like Frances Perkins learned a lot in her childhood and girlhood.
That's the truth. She was always learning, and she remembered what she learned, too.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Cynthia Perkins. In our next interview, we'll hear how Frances first used what she learned. We left Frances Perkins studying at Mount Holyoke and developing an interest in social reform. Now we'll interview Mrs. Florence Kelly about Frances' life as a social reformer in New York. Welcome, Mrs. Kelly.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
So how did you come to know Frances Perkins?
Well, I met her when I spoke at Mount Holyoke as Executive Secretary of the National Consumers League, which was an organization trying to get people, especially women, to buy only things that had been made by workers in good conditions. We were against child labor in sweatshops. She came to work with the National Consumers League later on.
Could you fill us in a little on how Frances got to New York City?
Well, after she graduated from Mount Holyoke, that was in 1902, she wanted to get into reform work right away. She had a real passion, but she was quite young and naive. So the director of the Charity Organization Society, who interviewed her, encouraged her to go and see more of the world, learn more about social work. So first she went home and lived with her family for a couple of years, and then she went to teach at a girls' school.
She made some important changes in her life around this time, too, didn't she?
Oh, yes. For one thing, she changed her name from Fanny to Frances. Miss Frances Perkins would be the name she used for the rest of her life, even after she married.
What else?
Another thing that really mattered to her was joining the Episcopal Church. Her family were Congregationalists, but she became an Episcopalian.
Do you think her faith influenced her work?
Undoubtedly. She told people that they should help poor people because it was what Jesus would want them to do. She liked the ceremonial aspect of the Episcopal services, but she had a very deep faith as well.
And at the same time, she was starting social work.
Yes. About this time, she worked at the famous Hull House with Jane Addams. She got first-hand experience there so that she never afterwards thought in abstractions. She saw the real conditions of laboring people. She also heard about labor unions from probably a different perspective than her conservative family gave her.
And was she getting paid?
Not at that point. That was when she was teaching school. Later, she had a paid position in Philadelphia investigating some of the most sordid, tragic parts of city life. She could handle it, though. She always seemed to be asking herself how things could be improved, and then she would do it.
And did she stay there?
Not she. She kept moving on. Next, she went to New York and got a degree, a master's degree in political science at Columbia. She made a lot of friends, some of them pretty influential friends. That's when I got to know her better.
So she was engaged in social work at this time. When would this be?
About 1910. Oh, that reminds me of one thing that made a huge impact on her. In 1911, she actually happened to be right by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory when that tragic fire occurred. You know how so many more people were killed, especially young women, because the employer kept the doors locked. She had supported the women in a strike for better conditions, but they didn't get them. And then she had to stand there watching them burning and jumping to their deaths.
She was an eyewitness.
Yes. Later, she gave a speech about it. She said, "This made a terrible impression on the people of the state of New York. I can't begin to tell you how disturbed the people were everywhere. It was as though we had all done something wrong." It made a really personal impact on her.
What did she do about it?
Well, to put it briefly, she went into politics. She was involved in a lot of causes around this time, but her central passion was fair treatment for workers. We wanted child labor laws, minimum wage laws, that kind of thing. So, of course, if you want laws, you have to convince lawmakers.
That makes sense.
Frances learned to work with the city and state legislatures. You've heard of Tammany Hall? Well, most people didn't like that group because, of course, they were corrupt. But Frances was willing to work with them. She would use them to get what she wanted. She developed a lot of skills in talking to politicians, who were men, of course, and convincing them that what she wanted was actually what they wanted.
So her being a woman, how did that affect her?
Well, women couldn't vote until 1920, so she learned to use her powers of persuasion. I think some men tended to be pleasantly surprised that even though she was a woman, she understood what was going on. Some of them resented her being so intelligent and fearless, but others learned to work with her, to ally with her.
Such as whom?
Well, the most famous would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wasn't president yet. He was the governor of New York. She worked with several different politicians, Democrats, but he was the one who would be best known now. She registered herself as a Democrat around this time.
Well, now that we've seen how Frances got into politics, our next interviewee will discuss her political career on the national level. Thank you so much, Mrs. Kelly. I'm sure you're all ready to hear about Frances Perkins' best-known achievements, her political career on the national level. We'll be interviewing Judge Charles Wyzanski, a lawyer and federal judge who worked closely with Miss Perkins during the presidency of FDR. Welcome, Mr. Wyzanski.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. Would you say Miss Perkins had an important impact on America during her career?
Oh, definitely, definitely. She was a huge impetus behind Roosevelt's New Deal.
How do you mean?
Well, you see, when Roosevelt came into office, he really didn't have a terribly clear platform. He had promised to do something about the horrible misery of the Depression, but he didn't have a huge agenda. Frances did.
What did her agenda include?
Well, she was very enthusiastic about the public works projects. That was a big part of the plan at the time to help with the unemployment. But of course, as Secretary of Labor, her biggest focus was on labor. The Labor Standards Bureau was one of her big projects, using the government's powers to make sure people worked in decent conditions for decent wages. She also promoted what was called social insurance to help older people and others who couldn't work to support themselves, which ended up being Social Security.
So Social Security was her invention?
Basically, the ideas involved had been floated, of course, but she was the person that made it work. It wasn't under her department's authority, though, due to what she called political chickenry.
Did that frustrate her?
Certainly. She could put up with that kind of thing, though. Since she was the first female cabinet secretary, at the time, the only female cabinet secretary, she had to be flexible and let go of some of her personal image to get what she wanted politically. For instance, when she was first sworn in, she didn't want there to be any controversy about where she would sit at political events. She might have chosen to insist on her right to sit with the cabinet members, but she said she would sit with the cabinet members' wives instead. She didn't want to come across as pushy or demanding, even when she was pushing hard for something.
You mentioned she was the first female cabinet secretary. That was a very new thing at the time. How did there come to be a female cabinet secretary in FDR's cabinet, and how was Miss Perkins chosen for the role?
It was more the other way around. When FDR was governor of New York, she worked for him in a similar role. So when he got to be president, he felt that she would be good at it. It wasn't as if he'd been elected on a traditionalist conservative platform or anything. He'd promised to change things, so, since he was also supported by many of Frances's friends and supporters, he decided she would make a good Secretary of Labor. And since she happened to be a woman, that's how we got a woman in the cabinet.
She still met a lot of opposition, though, didn't she?
Yes, she did. Besides the fact that she was a woman, there was also the fact that she was simply a controversial person at a controversial time. Her programs were kinds of things that the American government had never done before. Things like Social Security, of course, unemployment insurance, stricter child labor laws, that sort of thing. When she first became Secretary of Labor, she found that the organization of her department was falling apart. It was so full of corruption that she actually caught one of her former employees stealing records at night.
Wow.
She got it cleaned up, though. She was the type of person that, if she said you were leaving tomorrow, you left tomorrow. There was some more opposition I wanted to tell you about, though.
All right.
There was actually a point when Congress wanted to impeach her. In 1937, she defended a labor leader named Harry Bridges, who was believed to be a communist. Since he was not an American citizen, many people wanted to deport him, but Frances didn't believe there was enough evidence to do so. It afterwards turned out that he was a communist, but there really wasn't enough evidence at the time. Many congressmen didn't think so, though. They thought she was protecting a dangerous radical. She never was formally impeached, and the Bridges did get to stay in the United States. But many people still suspected her afterwards.
Speaking of organized labor, how about her work with strikes and labor problems?
She was a firm believer in negotiation to end strikes. However, many labor leaders distrusted her, even though she believed in unionization. They felt that a woman couldn't understand the world of organized labor, and that they had always had one of their own as secretary before. Settling strikes wasn't her strongest point, but she always gave it her best shot.
What were some other achievements of hers?
One really heroic thing that she did was helping refugees get out of Nazi Germany. Immigration was partially under her department, so she was able to get visas and passports for many people who were in danger, from surrealist artists to labor leaders. This was at a time when many in the government were willing to get America involved in even such a small way, especially to save people they saw as a bunch of bullshits. One Republican congressman was going to make a speech denouncing, in his words, the communist Secretary of Labor. Fortunately, I was able to talk him out of it.
That's a good thing. And that brings me to World War II. What role did Frances play then?
Well, like the rest of FDR's cabinet, she advised him during the war. Wartime conditions made the work of the Secretary of Labor less central than the Depression had, and it was especially difficult for a room full of men to listen to a woman's advice during wartime. Her most important achievements had already been cemented, but she helped to hold them together during the war.
How about after the war?
Roosevelt's death was a terrible shock to her, as it was to all of us. She stayed on in Truman's cabinet for only a short time before she resigned, more or less willingly, to enable him to create a more forceful public image for his cabinet. Then she wrote a memoir for the president called The Roosevelt I Knew.
Did she ever go back to politics?
She certainly did. She was appointed to the Civil Service Commission, which was supposed to oversee merit-based hiring and firing decisions in the civil service. However, it became a very difficult position for her when the commission also began investigating possible Soviet spies. This was the McCarthy era, and it was a very awkward time for an open-minded liberal to be investigating government officials. She wanted to clear out actual spies and traitors, but she didn't want people to be persecuted based on opinions and beliefs that didn't translate espionage. They believed that communists were risky government employees because of their beliefs, she said, put a question of double loyalty to the most conscientious man who was ever appointed to office, but she wasn't willing to consider every socialist-leaning thinker a dangerous traitor.
And what was the next phase in her life?
After dealing with all that controversy, I imagine she was almost glad when Eisenhower was elected. He was a Republican, and she realized the era of the New Deal was over. She knew her biggest achievements would remain, and she herself retired.
I think that's a good point to draw this portion of the interview to an end as well. Our next interviewee will discuss Miss Perkins' personal life. I'm sorry I've kept you so long, Mr. Wyzanski.
Please don't apologize. I've enjoyed reliving those days.
Joining us on the show. Our final visitor on this program is Mother Laura of All Saints Convent, an Episcopalian institution near Washington, D.C. She came to know Miss Perkins well, as she would visit the convent regularly during her most trying times in Washington. Welcome, Mother Laura.
Thank you.
First of all, can you tell us a little bit about Frances Perkins' faith?
Certainly. Since her youth, she was a member of the Episcopalian Church, and she took her faith very seriously. She didn't always speak about it, though. She was the type of person who was reluctant to discuss the things that were most centrally important to her. Many people considered her a typical New Englander in that respect.
Which makes sense, since she was from New England.
Which makes sense. But although she didn't speak much about it, her Christian faith was the real motivation behind what she did in her career. We are told to help the poor. Well, Frances would tell you that her work in government was the best way to help the poor in a modern industrial society. She once called her work an American version of the Golden Rule of the second great commandment to love thy neighbor. Not everyone, then or later, saw the New Deal as a Christian thing at all, but Frances did.
That was one very important part of her life. How about her personal life?
Although she used her maiden name and called herself Miss in professional life, she was married.
And to whom was she married?
In 1913, while working in New York, she married Paul Wilson, who also worked in politics and shared many causes with her. They were very happy together at first, but after a few years, her husband became mentally ill. It was frightening for Frances, I think, and she hated to talk about it. By the time she was Secretary of Labor, he was frequently hospitalized, and she had to support him. She continued caring for him until he died in 1952. Despite his psychological condition, she loved him and did her best to help him, but it was an additional strain that very few of her public critics knew about.
A very hard situation. Did they have any children?
Yes, they had one daughter, named Susanna. Unfortunately, she was a very difficult person as well. Frances struggled to raise her and give her a good life while also caring for her husband and leading her political life. This became even harder when Susanna was found to have inherited her father's mental illness, which came and went, repeatedly disrupting her life. When she was grown, she married a man who moved in circles that were the very reverse of Frances's New England respectability. They afterwards divorced, and Susanna later married a steadier character, but her mother never stopped worrying about her. Some said she worried too much about her.
And what support did she have in her life?
Well, as I mentioned before, her greatest support was her Christian faith. She also had several close friends, including many of the comparatively new group of female intellectuals. Their support certainly helped her. One friend's generosity helped her to be able to live in Washington, D.C., while still paying for her husband's care and her daughter's education.
That's good to hear. Thanks for sharing some of the less public aspects of Frances Perkins' life, Mother Laura.
Thank you.
Frances Perkins spent her later years teaching and encouraging the next generation. She taught at Cornell until her death in 1965. In a speech in 1962, she declared that Social Security is so firmly embedded in the American psychology today that no politician, no political party, no political group could possibly destroy this act and still maintain our democratic system. It is safe. It is safe forever and for the everlasting benefit of the people of the United States. Though her life was controversial, her achievements as a politician and as a woman have helped to build what America is today. A reporter once called her severe, just, and practical, and it was her courage in the use of these characteristics that made her a great American. This is 107.6 FM, KUSA. Tune in next week for another exciting episode of the Lives of Great Americans Hour.